President, please be seated. The chamber is now back in session. And before I hand the floor over to the defense counsel for Mr. Nguyen Chie to put questions to the witness, I would like to ask Counsel Victor Copé about the document that you intended to use, that is document D269/5.1. Have you included this document into the case file yet?
No, we haven't, but we will.
Obviously, this is the wrong sequence of events.
I understand, but this is something when preparing.
Council, just make a request. Make an 87.4 request, we'll deal with it.
An 87 request right now and right here. Obviously, it's a very relevant document. It's a book, an article from a book of Kiernan. The part on East Timor obviously is less relevant, but this particular article, when it comes to US and Indonesian perceptions of Vietnam's ambitions, that is relevant. Especially this page from that article, we believe is highly relevant, and therefore we request, on the basis of Rule 87.4, to have this admitted into evidence.
At least one sentence on why not earlier. This 87.4 has this time element.
It's a very good question. We could have done it earlier, but sometimes when you reread things, you just stumble upon it. And we could have done it earlier, I agree, but in the preparation of today's witness, I reread it and saw it again.
President, you may now have the floor. The International Deputy Co-Prosecutor, whether you have any observations regarding the putting of document that is the 269/5.1 as an evidence in the case file to put, so that the defense counsel can use it to put question to the expert.
Your Honour, it's a large book, so we haven't had an opportunity to review the book. But our concern more is with the relevance of the question, what United States and Indonesia's view of Vietnam's ambitions are, how relevant it is for this witness. This witness has been asked to testify on the treatment of the Vietnamese, the treatment of the Buddhists, and to a certain extent in relation to S21 and the treatment of groups in Cambodia generally as an anthropologist and as a genocide expert. He hasn't just come here to talk about his book. It's about the topics and everything that he's learned since then. But I think the question, if it relates to what you just mentioned, I think it's beyond his expertise, and I think it's beyond the relevance of the reason why you asked this expert to come. I mean, if the next session is going to be talking about foreign policy, foreign states' view of Vietnam's policy, that's not why this expert was brought here. Obviously he has good broad knowledge, but I think it's important we stay within his expertise. Otherwise we could end up talking about anything, and there doesn't seem to be much of a relevance to the topics that he was brought here for. So that's our view.
If I may respond, Mr. President, I was actually...
President, please hold on. Now I would like to give the floor to the lead co-lawyer for civil party to express your observation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning to all of you. The document, in fact, has been admitted, so I would like to provide to the defense the number. It's E3/9686, and the problem is simply that the document has not been included in the list that should be forwarded to the expert, and that it has not been included, therefore, in the interface, which has not allowed the parties to become aware of this document in a timely fashion. So E3/9686, and I completely support the observations of the co-prosecutor regarding the relevance of the questions that were put for the past half hour to the expert. We believe that the questions put by Counsel Koppes are completely outside of the expert's scope of expertise and outside of the scope of this segment of the trial through which the chamber proposed to have this expert testify. So we're calling the chamber to be more vigilant, to make sure that the questions put are relevant and connected to the expert's expertise, who is an anthropologist. We have heard Koppie tell us for the past day and a half that the expert was an anthropologist and therefore that he should remain focused on his field of expertise. So we are expressing the same thing again, and each time we have the impression that the questions that are put are outside of the expertise of the expert, we will be raising this issue again.
Let me start first by thanking very much civil parties for saying that it is actually already on the case file. We hadn't noticed that, so that makes it all easier. I was actually about to introduce my questions by indicating as to why I was asking my questions to Mr. Hinton. I have moved, without actually saying so, into a new chapter of my questions. We believe that the perception of DK and the rest of the world of Vietnam's foreign policy, of Vietnam, is intrinsically linked to the treatment of the Vietnamese. You cannot understand certain things in contemporaneous documents if you do not understand the position of DK in relation to Vietnam. So it's terribly important to not separate those two, something prosecution and the civil parties have been trying all along. The actions of Vietnam, Vietnam being the external enemy, are incredibly important to have a full understanding as to how we should see the alleged or the alleged treatment of the Vietnamese. So one cannot be seen without the other. That's why I'm focusing my questions now on Vietnam as the external enemy, and then we'll move slowly into those within the CPK assisting Vietnam being perceived as the internal enemies. And from that follows how the treatment of the Vietnamese should really be seen.
I think we have said it before. I trust this expert is able to say if a question, to state if a question is outside his expertise. We have all noted this kind of crossover, which is permanent. I've also noted that you repeatedly said, sorry, not my field. So why we would still ask, obviously, counsel to keep in mind that this is an anthropologist. Yeah.
I agree very much, Judge Fentz. I'm not sure if at all times Mr. Hinton kept himself to that particular expertise. However, let me move to my question. But before I move to that question as to how Vietnam's foreign policy was seen, my team has just informed me that there is in fact a video of a speech of late King Father Sihanouk, a speech probably in the early 80s, in which he literally addresses Vietnam as A Yun, the contemptible Yun, and refers to them as the crocodile. It's something, of course, that you are not in a position to verify, but my Khmer team members are saying that despite what...
What's the number? What's the...
No, it's not. It's not on the case file.
Then stop discussing it, Council. Sorry. Not on the case file, and as you said, the court is in no position to verify what you're saying. I don't think we should discuss it.
Well, if it's not on the case file...
President, the chamber gives the floor to Judge Laven.
Well, I'm not going to comment about documents that are not on the case file, but I'd like to return to the document that you would like to use, Council Koppe. And apparently, the document indexed E3/9686 only contains 6 pages and not page 105, so apparently, which you apparently would like to use. So this document has not been placed in its entirety on the case file. So if you wish to use it, we would like to know if the parties object to it or not. There are 2 questions. There's a question of the relevance of your questions, and there's also the question of the admissibility of the document. So I don't know if the parties wish to object to the admissibility of this document.
So, Your Honours, I believe we were informed it was on the case file, but now you're saying only a few pages. Your Honours, I think to have these proceedings run in an orderly manner, the defence have put forward many documents to put to this witness. We object to the using of this document. It's not on the interface. It sounds like now it's not, hasn't been put before the chamber properly. It hasn't been given to the defence. In the way it was pitched in terms of the question that was to be used, we think it's of minimal relevance. If it was so important to the defence, they should have placed the document on the case file a lot earlier. This witness has been scheduled to testify for a long time, and I think for order in the court in terms of predictability, I don't think this document should be admitted.
It's on the case file, Mr. President, since March 2010, probably actually placed by the prosecution on the case file. It doesn't have an E3 number, that's all. It's only a few sentences. Mr. Hinton has been able, in the break, to have a look at it. We believe it's very relevant because it confirms the position of DK in relation to Vietnam's foreign policy toward Democratic Kampuchea. That it was not something, some paranoia on the side of DK, but rather a fully backed view of Vietnam and Soviet Union ambitions. So we believe it's very relevant, and I would like to remind the court that I actually started with an open question, and then Mr. Hinton asked for a confirmation of in a document which I was happy to provide.
President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning to all of you. Simply as an observation, in the course of this discussion, it's true that Rule 87.4 states that when we prepare an expert, we do not necessarily always think about it way ahead of time. I'd like to remind you that Mr. Hinton was programmed only a month ago, and since he's an expert, and since this is a document that is connected with Ben Kiernan, who the expert says he knows well, and which he used for his research, I don't think there should be a problem regarding the use of this document.
មានបញ្ហា
President Council Victor Kope, do you have any other points to make? But I would like to notify you that you cannot proceed with putting questions to the expert. We need to wait until the chamber, the bench, clarify on this issue first.
No problem at all, Mr. President, because I have plenty of other documents still that say the same thing. So let's move away, Mr. Hinton, as to what President Ford and Kissinger and also President Suharto are saying about Vietnam's ambitions. There is ample evidence also on the case file which does indicate what neighboring countries perceived as Vietnam's ambitions at that time. Do you know who Deng Xiaoping was?
President, the floor is given to the Deputy Co-Prosecutor.
Mr. President, I would just like to make a general point at this stage. Throughout this morning, the Council has been making statements about facts and then presenting another question to the expert. We're submitting that's not appropriate. Council should just put questions to the expert, giving a small speech about other people's views and what's on the case file and what it proves and what it doesn't prove. I don't think it's appropriate. I think Council should just ask the witness the question but not give speeches. This has happened a number of times today, and I would just like to make this objection now in terms of the manner of questioning. Sometimes there needs to be background, but certainly not to make speeches about what the evidence is and what it's not, and then ask the expert a different question. So that's the observation I would like to make.
Thank you very much for this observation, but my question was, I don't hear any objection, whether Mr. Hinton knows who Deng Xiaoping was.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. Yes, I do. I just want to also add in a point of clarification in a couple of regards. In terms of the discussions that have been taking place about my research, and going back to a comment that you made, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer, about Ben Kiernan being supportive of my work, if you open up and look at the preface of my book, I cite many scholars, David Chandler, Maybe Ahara, Judy Ledgerwood, John Marston. There are literally dozens of scholars, I think. And this sort of movement of saying there's sort of Ben Kiernan, myself, David Chandler, really reduces the number of scholars who've worked in this area and the number of scholars in particular that inform my research. There are many different people. We've mentioned Nyan Chanda, tool slaying notebooks, CPK notebooks, radio broadcast. There's the work of people like David Hawk and Hanum, who worked in the 1980s on the charge of genocide, Greg Stanton, Craig Edginson, Steve Hedder, who you mentioned, Michael Vickery, who you mentioned, court transcripts, the list goes on in terms of anthropologists, Maybe Ahara, who worked in a village and has done work on the lived experience of DK. The list is extensive, John Marston. So I think in terms of trying to understand the DK period and what happened, it's important in relationship to my work to understand that I've been influenced by a wide range of people, a number of documents, and I don't want it to be reduced down to this very narrow vision of who an influence is on my scholarship. The other thing, people have been, there's a way of talking, an anthropologist. I tried to explain that an anthropologist is concerned with lived experience, but also needs to be holistic and learns about multiple fields. Nowadays, in terms of scholarship, many scholars operate in a number of different interdisciplinary fields. And so, I'm happy with the focused question. to try and see if I can answer. If you actually, if you ask a specific focused question, that would be good. So I just wanted to make those two sort of points of clarification, just so we don't have these sort of reductive images of what an anthropologist is, and also the number of scholars with whom I'm interacted. I think if the translation was correct, it was said that I'm a close friend of Ben Kiernan. I'm a colleague of Ben Kiernan. I think I may have had lunch with him once when I gave a talk at Yale. I don't think I've ever talked to him on the telephone, for example. So I think we need to be careful about making reductive statements about influences, and recognize that as a scholar, I've drawn on a number of different sources and coming to my conclusions, and that as an anthropologist, I do my best, for example, to understand foreign policy, and certainly in relationship to seeking the truth, and trying to understand the relationship of U.S. foreign policy in relationship to Vietnam, and also the logic of the CPK leadership. I think for understanding the truth, that's absolutely important. But I would just request that, as opposed to piecemeal sort of selective questions, a good focused question, and I can tell you whether or not I can respond broadly to the point. I was happy to respond to the other document, but now it's not admissible. But if you have another document, I'm happy to proceed.
Before I return to my Deng Xiaoping question, now that you brought it up, I'm happy to be to be a bit honest as to why I was focusing on Chandler and Kiernan, because when I read your book, it was as if I was reading Kiernan or Chandler. Let me give you an example. In one chapter, or one or two chapters, you use the word paranoia, paranoia with Pol Pot, paranoia with Party Center, paranoia in S21, about 25 times. Real and perceived enemies, especially the word perceived, I think about 15 times. That is a theory developed by Kiernan and Chandler predominantly. So that's where it's coming from, but that's not important. Let me move away from that, Mr. Hinton, and let me get back to Deng Xiaoping. Do you know who he is?
As I said before, yes, I do, but I'd like to also respond that in terms of the scholarship, I don't think that it's just Ben Kiernan and David Chandler who speak this way. It's many different people. In terms of the relationship and the use of the word paranoia, there's some people who bandy it about, but I actually embed my discussion of paranoia in relationship to local cultural understandings and do it in a very different way. I think and talk about building paranoia and the CPK leadership, real or perceived, is something that a large body of scholarship, most of the scholars I read, support in their conclusions. I think it's very reductive of the scholarship to imply that it's simply two people. I also think that it's important to look, for example, at the work of Cambodians in the Documentation Center of Cambodia, who you've mentioned before, who also have done extensive research now. So again, I think to try and understand the DK regime solely through these two lenses, as if that's the scholarship, is a reduction. And I also think that it's to say that they're exactly the same. Earlier, you implied that there were significant differences between the two, if I understood you correctly.
True. Maybe at one other time we should have this discussion. But I'll get back to the word paranoia and real and perceived enemies later. Again, Deng Xiaoping, who was he, and do you know what what China's position was on Vietnam's policy toward democratic Kampuchea?
Yes, and in terms of policy, the policy of China during the DK regime was to support the CPK largely and to contain Vietnam.
Deng Xiaoping once called Vietnam the hooligans of the East. In your expert opinion, being someone who says he knows quite a bit about propaganda. Is that a racist vision of Vietnam as well? Vietnam being the hooligans of the East?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. So we don't have a context for the question. Maybe if you could provide more context and also maybe say what your opinion is, and I could say whether or not I'm able to, give my affirmation that seems reasonable or not. But I think in terms of a series of decontextualized questions, it's very hard to proceed. You yourself tried to say that what I was supposed to speak about was my book and the research in my book predominantly, and my ethnographic field research from 1994 to 1995. And when I spoke outside of that purview to talk about my subsequent research, I was told not to talk about it. Now you seem to be telling me that I should speak about all sorts of different things that are outside of this domain. I'm happy to try and assist the process as an expert witness and answer questions, but it seems that you have a contradiction in the sorts of things that you're asking me about. And also when I received information from the prosecution, the Office of the Co-Prosecutors, and from the civil party lawyers, they asked specific questions related to documents. I have a binder full of documents to which I referred very readily. I don't have those. Instead, I'm getting fragments of information that are decontextualized, some of which I'm being shown for the first time during breaks. Again, I very much want you to be able to express the views of the defense about these issues, and I would like to assist and help in that. But I need more specific context and more order. And again, I note this contradiction that on the one hand, when it's suitable, I'm just, quote unquote, just an anthropologist, but then at other times I'm supposed to be a foreign policy expert. I think the purview of my competence is interdisciplinary as a genocide scholar. But again, I think that, you can't have it both ways.
With that last point, I fully agree, Mr. Hinton. Let me read to you a document that you actually...
Council placeholder and International Deputy Co-Prosecutor, you have the floor.
Your Honour, I think the witness has given the answer, and that the questions by counsel need to be very specific and relevant to the segments of this trial. And these circuitous questions are putting this expert in a very difficult position. So we'd ask that counsel focus on treatment of the Vietnamese, treatment of the Buddhists, S21, and any directly related questions to that may be broader. And also, because documents are not in front of this expert, if counsel could give a specific document and ask him to comment on it rather than a general discussion. I think the expert needs this support.
I was about to do that, Mr. President. That is a document that was provided to Mr. Hinton. It's E3/7325. It's a report, January 1979, of the Standing Committee member of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo. It, in our view, represents China's views on Vietnam, Vietnam's foreign policy, which we again believe is a crucial thing to understand DK's policy when it comes to Vietnam, when it comes to the matter of internal and external enemies. Let me read to you, Mr. Hinton, from page ERN 01001622, Khmer 01063797. The French I will provide a bit later, with your leave, Mr. President. It says the following. In 1973, in order to remind the Cambodian leaders to maintain constant vigilance, Chairman Mao also told Sihanouk that Ho Chi Minh had talked with Chairman Mao about the establishment of an Indo-China Federation. After 1974, Vietnamese troops coordinated with the revolutionary forces of Cambodia in various battles in Cambodia. Vietnam seized this opportunity to cultivate a group of pro-Vietnam Cambodian leaders. The seed of disaster was thus sown. A little bit before, as a matter of fact, as early as before the liberation of South Vietnam, Vietnam had harbored malicious intentions. The small handful of its war maniacs, at the instigation of their social imperialist behind-the-scenes boss, had wanted to encroach on Cambodia, drawing it into the so-called Indochina alliance and turning it into the springboard and base of social imperialism. This, we believe, represents the official Chinese view on Vietnam. This, we believe, was shared by the American administration in '75. Yesterday we spoke about the word Yun, whether that refers to Vietnamese or whether that refers to Vietnam. In the light of that word, also used in the revolutionary flags, the document that was shown to you yesterday, or read out to you yesterday, what is your reaction to these Chinese perceptions of Vietnam's foreign policy toward democratic Kampuchea?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. I believe that those perceptions may well have been the perceptions of the leadership, and certainly appears to have been a fear of the CPK leadership.
You have been called to testify specifically in relation to the treatment of Vietnamese people in DK. You've said all kinds of things yesterday about Vietnamese. They were all killed, that's what you said. My question to you is, if you can say something from an anthropological view, how DK's perception of Vietnam's ambitions was intertwined with its treatment of Vietnamese citizens.
Again, it would be useful to have specific documents at hand. We've seen a number introduced, so the point that indeed I think the CPK leadership had fears about Vietnam, and I think part of these fears became manifest through a discourse of incitement, strong, vehement, racist, anti-Vietnamese, and anti-Vietnam discourse. But as I said before, the word Yuan is a diffuse word, right? So it can refer to ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia as well as to people from Vietnam, to both groups. So it's a word that's used and has a double valence.
But now we're actually getting to the point that I'm trying to get at. You always seem to be saying DK had fears. DK had a perception of an enemy. Enemies were perceived, sometimes real, but mostly perceived. Democratic Kampuchea was paranoia. Pol Pot was paranoia. Everybody was paranoia within the CPK. My question is, isn't it true that Vietnam was a real enemy and that the fears of DK and the CPK were real and were backed by countries like China, Indonesia, United States? There was a real threat, a threat that materialized by this blatant act of aggression, the invasion in '79.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. While there are elements of truth to what you're saying, need to be acknowledged, I think that you can't simply make a singular statement that covers the entire decay period. As I said before, there's a temporal flow, and you yourself invoked the work of Michael Vickery, who has emphasized the need to think about temporal variation. So to simply take something, to decontextualize it, erases the nuance of the historical flow. In terms of the rhetoric about Vietnam and about, as the word is used, Yuan that appears, as I said before, if you look at the enemies of the state, you have a change. And again, this came out if you look at the enemies that were perceived at S-21, it's very evident. If you go back to M13, as I said before, you have people who are thought to be Lon Nol spies who are being brought in. There's a little bit of purging, internal purging that's going on. It shifts. The Khmer Republic is targeted in part in the next phase. Then it goes on and it begins, especially after March 1976, to focus much more on internal enemies. And you have the beginning of large-scale purges, as you're well aware, as you begin to have towards, especially accentuated and becoming much more prevalent in the CPK discourse, a focus on Vietnam and on Yuan, one that as the war escalates into 1978 becomes more and more, becomes a stronger and stronger strand. But it's important to know that from the very beginning, the word Yuan, traces of it can be found, but it definitely increased in vehemence through time. But as I said before, if you look at the course of the genocide against the ethnic Cham, and you look at the course of the genocide against ethnic Vietnamese, the element of racism was there from the beginning, even as the public expression of it, again, if you look at the volume of it, was stronger in 1978 than it was, for example, in 1975. Having said that, the concerns being real, I believe that the leaders of the CPK believed that the threat was real, and they reacted accordingly. Whether or not to say that the fact of the January Vietnam invasion, Vietnamese-backed invasion at that point in time, the fact of it taking place, you can't simply say, oh, the threats were reasonable the entire time. It's a historical process. You mentioned, again, we talked, well, I mentioned before Nyan Tanda's work. He talks about you have Khmer Rouge DK forces going into Vietnam and committing all sorts of atrocities. He went to villages. So there was also a provocation that played into this process. But so to lead up to the events of early January, where the PRK regime eventually was formed, you have to look at the larger historical context. You can't look at the DK regime as passive. They are actors. And there's another dimension of it, which is that to say that there's a felt threat of an external enemy is one dimension, but there's also a felt threat of internal enemies, and you constantly get that, internal enemies burrowing from within that may be agents of, CIA, KGB, Vietnam, what have you.
Let me stop you there. I apologize. But in your answer, although very long, I'm not quite sure if you answered my question, but again, I hear you saying that, sure, they thought there was a threat, or they perceived, you didn't say perceived, but they perceived there to be a threat. The reason I was putting the historical context to you before is that these fears were genuine, were real, and were perceived by everybody who knew at the time that they were real, that it isn't some form of paranoia, and that only in understanding Vietnam's foreign policy you can understand the revolutionary flag that was cited by the prosecution. So my question again is, and that's I think what most scholars seem to be doing, is minimizing the threat of Vietnam. And let me put it a bit further. Yesterday, I think about 4 or 5 times, you made a comparison to Nazi Germany. You said yourself that you are an expert on propaganda. Isn't it true there is a huge difference between, on the one hand, how Nazi Germany viewed Jews and how they were treated, as opposed to how Vietnam saw how DK saw Vietnam, and how DK ultimately treated its citizens, its Vietnamese citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. And I think you raise a very interesting point, an important point, and it's one that I tried to convey in the very first session when I began to speak about Raphael Lemkin and the origins of the word genocide. Part of what I was attempting to do at that time, now that you've raised the issue again, is to trace the evolution of the word, how it began, and how it emerged in the aftermath of what is now called the Holocaust. And I say what is now called the Holocaust is because if you go back to Nuremberg, of course, that wasn't a term that was being used. It was crimes of aggression, crimes of peace that were being, crimes against humanity. Those were things that were being talked about even as it's being introduced. What's happened is in common discourse, and I think if I remember the testimony of Philip Short, this is a good example, but people have a discourse, a way of saying, well, genocide is what happened in the Holocaust. Well, if it looks like the Holocaust, it's genocide. If it doesn't look like the Holocaust, it's not genocide. That perception, that common perception and that argument is not showing understanding of genocide studies, the field of genocide studies, and the scholarship that's been done, the ways in which the definition's been unpacked and looked at in different ways, looking at the 1946 resolution that was passed that included political groups at that point in time, was open to looking at economic group and social groups. It decontextualizes and dehistoricizes, and even the nuance of the debates at the UN about the word genocide at this time, right? These terms, what is a national group? Should we include cultural genocide as an issue? These were all debated and emerged as a historical product at a moment in time. But again, to think, oh, something is like or not like the Holocaust, therefore it is or is not genocide, is a misput way of framing it, even from the terms of the Genocide Convention. Having said that, I'd like to note that, as I said before, I've traced out a process of what I call genocidal priming and genocidal activation, right? So we go through a series of states. As in the DK regime, as in Nazi Germany, you had a state of socioeconomic upheaval. You had, again, a process by which difference was manufactured, where you had pre-existing divisions that were crystallized over time. You had the marking of difference. You had the reorganization of society so that the people who were being targeted, and the obvious example, one of those is the rounding up of Jews, placement in concentration camps, regulation, a bureaucracy of control, a targeting of these groups, and then once they're stigmatized, disempowered, and a gradual elimination of the groups that have been targeted in whole or in part. That process itself is a direct parallel and a process and a dynamic that occurs in a number of genocides. It's one that occurs during the DK regime. It's one that occurred during the Holocaust. Having said that, as I mentioned before, had I been able to go into length about the origins of the word genocide and the way we think about it, there are other sorts of genocides that take place, for example, than genocides against indigenous peoples in different places. But again, it's important not to simply say, oh, you know, do we have Auschwitz? Although some people link tool slang to Auschwitz as a metaphor, it's to look at what the understanding of genocide is, what the dynamics of genocide are, and then to look to see if the processes are similar. Based on my research, it seems clear that this is a case of genocide both on the basis of the 1946 resolution, on the basis of the UN Genocide Convention, on the basis of a wide body of scholarship that allows attention to a wide range of groups. In all those different ways, it's a genocide.
I find the comparison very unpractical, but the reason that I refer to it is because you kept bringing it up yesterday. But let me, now that we're on the subject, make a step to the side and ask you, with two or three examples, whether you believe, as a genocide scholar, that these mass killings or mass deportations or mass confinements are also can also be qualified as genocide. Let me give you 4 examples. The mass internment of Japanese people in 1941 and subsequently in the United States, dehumanizing, I suppose, and generalizing Japanese citizens. Do you consider that to be a genocide as well, or acts of genocide?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. Again, it depends on what definition you use to begin to make a determination of whether or not this would or would not be a genocide. So are you using the UN Genocide Convention, or using Helen Fine's definition, or using Israel Charney's definition? You know, it depends. First of all, the first thing you need to do is have your methodological definition, and then your conclusions proceed from there.
Well, let me interrupt you. The problem, I believe, with your opinions is that the word genocide is all over the place. It is mass killings, political violence. It doesn't seem to matter. So my question to you, you said you are a genocide scholar. The mass internment of Japanese citizens in 41, dehumanizing in the context of a social, economic upheaval in the war, etc. Was that an act of genocide in the US?
Your Honor, I have no objection to the question, but the point I raised earlier, the critiquing and criticising of the expert prior to asking a question, I think you should ask the direct question. And the other aspect is he's mischaracterising this expert's position. And he states that he's all over the place using definitions and not. No, he's not. I mean, counsel, everyone's read his book. He's very clear about what he means when he's talking about genocide, regardless of how your honours decide. So criticising the expert, mischaracterising his position, and then asking him a question, that's just not appropriate. It's a reasonable question. He should just ask the question rather than make a speech every time he proceeds with the question.
Fine, no problem. I'll just ask the question. In your expert opinion, the treatment of the Japanese in the US in 41 and subsequently, was that a form of genocidal acts on part of the United States government?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. And you raise a very interesting question, one that deserves further study. I'm not an expert on the Japanese internment, though I know something about it. Again, one of the mistakes that's frequently made is people bring up a random case about which not a lot is known, or they may not know a lot, and they begin to make pronouncements about whether something is or is not genocide. In the corpus of literature that exists within the field of genocide studies, you will find virtually very little or no mention of this case, which, again, does not mean that it should be taken up and considered, but you need to do in-depth research along the lines of the research I've done on the DK period and on a number of other genocides. Having said that, if you look at the process of genocidal priming, as I mentioned before, where you have groups in a situation of upheaval, which is taking place at the time, you have groups which begin to be marked and also organized, you see the potential of a genocidal process being activated. So if I had to give you a quick answer with the caveat that to give you a full, accurate answer, I would need to do more research and become an expert on this area. I would say that you have a situation that's lukewarm, right, in terms if we think of this metaphor of heat. But as I said before, there's also a process of genocidal activation. That process is not present. So we get to a situation where you have the potential for genocide, but in fact not a case of genocide. But again, I would put the caveat that for all of us, we want to do in-depth research on a case. And this isn't a case that is discussed widely within the field of genocide studies. It's one that's mentioned. It's one that deserves further study.
Let me move on and give you a second example. The deportation massive deportation of Vietnamese people of Chinese origin, mostly Chinese origin, by the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, leading to hundreds of thousands of boat refugees, massive deaths of those people. Would you consider that to be genocide?
Again, as opposed to doing a simple with not having a massive body of knowledge and doing in-depth study, as all of us should do, this again is not a case that's within the canon and the focus of study of the field of genocide studies. So I'd like to do, before giving a pronouncement, I would like to do lots more research. But once again, I would say based on what I do know, that again, if you look at the process of genocidal priming, you again have a situation that perhaps is lukewarm, but there's not activation. But again, it would be superfluous to simply throw out, and as an arbiter of truth, yes or no, without in-depth study. As I said before, with regard to DK regime, I've done extensive research, in-depth research, that seems clear that it's a case of genocide. It's a conclusion that's supported within the field of genocide studies by many others as a case of genocide studies. So going back to the topic at hand, which is DK, yeah.
I believe Chandler and Short all say there wasn't any genocide. But let me give you a third example, an example which probably had the most effect on Cambodia, which probably had a deep impact on strategy, tactics of the CPK. An example of of mass killings very close to Cambodia. The 1965 massive killings, about 500,000 in a few months, of Indonesian communists by the regime of Suharto, apparently backed by CIA and American authorities. Was that a genocide?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. That case is much more discussed within the field of genocide studies, especially given the intent of the 1946 resolution, which included political groups. That case is, within the field, considered a case of genocide.
And subsequently, using that same reasoning, and I believe you said it yesterday, the treatment of the Vietnamese by the Lon Nol Republic would amount to acts of genocide as well?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. I believe what I said is that we need to study this period much more, but that it's quite possible that this was a genocide. But again, with the need to study moments of history that are understudied, we don't have enough knowledge about to make a considered answer. We would need to study more, but I think the possibility, that is certainly a possibility.
And the third example of mass killings very close by, supported by, again, the United States, the mass killings in East Timor, 1975. Keenan calls it a genocide. Do you too?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Defense Lawyer. Again, within the field of genocide studies, this is a case that's often discussed as genocide.
Knowing now a bit clearer as to what you consider genocide, I would now like to move back to the internal enemies, but I see, Mr. President, it is 11:30, so maybe this is a good time to break.
Thank you, Counsel. And Counsel for Keo Sampon, you have the floor.
Yes, Mr. President, very briefly speaking, I would like that we take advantage of the break to provide a folder with a few documents to the expert, given that these are documents that normally were provided to him before by the chamber, but however, I will be referring to these documents when I cross-examine him. And these are documents E3/123, E3/221, E3/4604, E3/4527, E3/3995, and E3/727. And in particular, there was a document that was used by the prosecutor, but since I didn't remember the number, the index number that he had in his folder, I'm providing it to you again. These are documents that are on the interface in any case. So with your leave, Mr. President, can we use them?
Yeah.
Yes, you may do so.
President, do you have access to these documents? Did you note that down now? Because I think the idea is for you to read it. Oh, I see. Okay.
President, it's now appropriate for our lunch break. We take a break now and resume at 1:30 this afternoon. Court officer, please assist Mr. Expert during the break time and invite him back into the courtroom at 1:30 this afternoon. Security personnel, you are instructed to take Kyu Sampon to the waiting room downstairs and have him return to attend the proceedings this afternoon before 1:30. The court is now in recess.